12th of December 1943, North Atlantic 0340 hours. The sea was black and merciless, swallowing the light from a burning B-24 as it broke apart in the freezing wind. Smoke curled across the waves where men once fought to stay alive. Their life jackets glowed faintly under the moonlight, bright yellow against a horizon of death. Within minutes, their voices vanished into the cold. The radio crackled one last time before silence claimed the sky. Back at the Newfoundland Air Station, Lieutenant Eleanor Vance stood before a stack of after-action reports, her hands trembling. The numbers were brutal. Every crewman rescued from the water had already been dead. Not from wounds, not from drowning, but from cold. They died wrapped in the very equipment meant to save them. She stared at the charts, the heartbeats that froze mid-air, and asked herself the question. No one else dared to. Why were they sent? To fight the ocean without a weapon against it. Outside, the roar of another patrol's engines faded into the blizzard. Inside, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything, not through bullets but through heat. It wasn't glory she wanted. It was survival. The kind born of defiance, not orders. This is the forgotten front of World War II. The battle against the cold, the ignorance, and the belief that some deaths were unavoidable. What she created in secret would rewrite the limits of endurance and prove that compassion could be as revolutionary as any weapon. Stay with us. Like, subscribe, and share this story, because the war you're about to hear wasn't fought with guns but with fire against the ice. The storm had not stopped since that night. Every dawn, the base siren wailed through sleet and static, summoning flight crews to missions they might never return from. The hangars smelled of fuel and damp wool. Frost crawled along the metal walls like a living thing. Lieutenant Eleanor Vance walked the frozen tarmac with a clipboard clutched to her chest, her eyes fixed on the line of stretchers coming off the rescue trucks. The men were blue when they arrived, skin, waxy lips, cracked eyes half open in disbelief. They'd been alive when their planes went down. Every one of them had made it into the water, life vests, inflated gear intact, and every one of them was dead within minutes. Not from fire, not from shrapnel, from cold. At first, the reports sounded like background noise in the chaos of war. Crew recovered, cause hypothermia. But the frequency began to gnaw at her. The numbers didn't add up. By January, Eleanor had gathered 63 individual rescue logs from Atlantic patrol squadrons. 47 of them listed exposure as the primary cause of death. In each case, the victims had been retrieved less than 15 minutes after ditching. The Atlantic wasn't killing them slowly, it was killing them instantly. She pinned the reports to the wall of her office, line after line of names and coordinates, a graveyard built out of ink. Outside commanders talked about fuel efficiency, radar failures, and U-boats. No one mentioned the human cost measured in degrees Fahrenheit. When she brought it up in a briefing, a major dismissed her with a smirk. "You can't fight the ocean, Lieutenant. We lose men to nature. It's part of the math." She wrote those words down, part of the math. That phrase haunted her more than any crash report. If death could be accepted as an equation, then maybe the numbers could be rewritten. She began collecting data the only way she could quietly. Medical officers gave her body temperature readings. Rescue crews provided radio logs detailing how long each survivor had stayed conscious after impact. She built a pattern across hundreds of entries. At an average water temperature of 38 degrees, loss of motor control occurred after 4 minutes. Unconsciousness followed at 10, cardiac arrest by 15. Even the best swimmers were powerless. The North Atlantic wasn't a battlefield. It was a killing field disguised as water. Her colleagues called it statistical noise. She called it a warning. The deeper she dug, the clearer the picture became. Every piece of gear was designed for flight, oxygen masks, flak jackets, parachutes, but nothing for the fall. The Air Corps had spent millions making men invincible in the sky while leaving them naked in the sea. The irony burned. They feared bullets that rarely hit, yet ignored the cold that always did. One morning she visited the morgue at the base hospital. The attendant, an old medic from Alaska, stood beside a row of bodies thawing under dim light. "They never even had frostbite," he said softly. Their hearts just stopped. Eleanor pulled back a blanket and stared at the pale hand of a 20-year-old gunner. His wristwatch had frozen at 0347 3 minutes after the distress call. She felt a weight in her chest that had nothing to do with grief. It was anger, not at the sea, but at the silence. That night she stayed in her office long after the generators shut down. Her fingers were numb from the cold, but she kept writing. On one side of her desk lay the official report claiming unavoidable operational loss. On the other, her handwritten chart connecting temperature, time, and death. The line was perfect, too perfect. No randomness, no luck, just physics. Unavoidable, she whispered, only if no one bothers to prevent it. In the following weeks, she interviewed survivors, those rare few who had lasted long enough to be rescued. Their stories were eerily consistent. They spoke of the pain fading, of a strange calm of light dimming behind their eyelids. One man described hearing the plane's engines long after it sank, as if the sound itself refused to die. Another told her, "The water didn't feel like water. It felt like glass closing around me." She wrote every word down, every heartbeat lost between statistics. Eleanor requested data from British Coastal Command, hoping the Allies might have faced the same problem. The reply came in a sealed envelope marked confidential. The figures were identical. 92% of airmen lost in ditching incidents perished from hypothermia. The British had studied it, then buried the results. Morale concerns, the memo read, releasing data may discourage aircrew. She slammed the folder shut. The real reason wasn't morale, it was pride. The military could accept mechanical failure, enemy fire, even bad luck, but not negligence, not oversight. That realization hit her harder than any winter gale. The enemy wasn't nature. It was the institution's refusal to see beyond tradition. The military treated courage as armor, as if bravery could insulate flesh. But courage didn't stop the cold. Courage froze just as fast as fear, and in that blindness lay the quietest massacre of the war. One afternoon, during a blizzard that grounded all flights, Eleanor gathered the base medics in the mess hall. She spread her charts across the table, curves, timelines, temperature maps. "We're not losing men to combat," she said. "We're losing them to arithmetic." The medics stared in silence as she pointed to the graph that showed every pilot's death converging at the same 10-minute mark. "They drown in air that's 40 degrees colder than their courage," she continued. "We give them parachutes for gravity, flak vests for shrapnel, but nothing for the ocean that waits beneath every mission." Her voice trembled not from fear but fury. "Every rescue we send out is a recovery. Every man we pull from that sea is a body, not a survivor. Tell me how that's acceptable." No one spoke, but in their eyes she saw the first cracks of understanding. Eleanor spent the next days testing fabrics, dunking samples into buckets of freezing salt water behind the hangar. Wool absorbed, canvas stiffened, rubber cracked. Nothing lasted. But failure didn't dissuade her, it focused her. If no existing material could protect against the cold, then something new had to be made. Something electric, alive, capable of generating its own heat. She jotted equations beside water temperature readings, connecting biology to engineering, like a surgeon tracing a pulse. When the base commander found her working in the maintenance bay at midnight, surrounded by wires and soaked uniforms, he frowned. "Lieutenant, what exactly are you doing?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Redefining survival, sir." He walked away, shaking his head, muttering something about unnecessary experiments. But the phrase no longer stung, because by then Eleanor knew what the numbers meant. The deaths weren't random acts of war, they were predictable, measurable, and therefore preventable. The cold was not invincible, it was calculable, and what could be calculated could be beaten. That night she pinned a final note above her charts, written in pencil so hard it nearly tore the paper. If the data was right, then the enemy wasn't the bullet, it was our blindness. The base had grown quieter since Eleanor's last confrontation in the mess hall, but silence didn't mean peace. It meant she had become invisible, filed away as another overzealous junior officer. Her report on hypothermia deaths was dismissed at command level with a single line, "Problem outside operational control." But the words didn't stop her. They hardened her resolve. If the system refused to act, she would. The question wasn't whether men could survive the North Atlantic, it was how to make them. She began, where no one else would, with scraps. She took apart old radio sets, stripped the copper wiring, and studied how the resistors converted current into heat. Her hands blistered from solder burns, but she barely noticed. Every night after the lights went out, the maintenance hangar became her laboratory. A single bulb swung from a beam, throwing long shadows across a workbench cluttered with half-dismantled flight suits, thermometers, and coils of wire scavenged from wrecked planes. Her idea was reckless, even dangerous, an electrically heated flight vest powered by the aircraft's own emergency battery pack. The logic was simple. If voltage could transmit a distress signal, it could also transmit warmth. But the execution was madness. When she presented her first sketch to the base quartermaster, he blinked as if she'd told him she was building a lightning storm. Electricity. On a pilot's chest, Lieutenant, are you trying to fry them before the enemy does? The laughter that followed stung worse than the cold. One senior officer suggested she stick to typing reports. Another told her the project was morally comforting but mechanically absurd. They talked about priorities, about budgets, about men's courage. She realized then that their faith in heroism was the real enemy. It excused every preventable death as fate. So she stopped asking for permission. She enlisted the help of Sergeant Tom Larkin, a mechanic who'd served with her father before the war. Larkin was the kind of man who could fix a bomber engine with a wrench and a prayer. When she showed him the burned-out heating coil from her first prototype, he just grinned. "You're playing with lightning, ma'am," he said, "but I've seen worse ideas win wars." Together they stripped insulation from communication cables, testing how long each length could glow before melting. The first trial ended in smoke. The second blew a fuse that plunged half the hangar into darkness. Eleanor coughed through the haze, laughing and crying at once. "At least it's warm," she said. Larkin called her crazy, but didn't stop helping. They tested everything: nickel, wire, copper, mesh, salvaged aluminum strips. Most burned out within seconds. The real challenge was power control. Too much current and the suit would ignite. Too little and it was useless. She designed a manual rheostat using a modified radio tuner, letting the wearer adjust the temperature by turning a dial sewn into the vest's lining. The innovation was crude, but it worked for a minute. Then the stitching caught fire. When the smoke cleared, the smell of scorched fabric clung to her coat. Failure again. Yet with every failure came understanding. The problem wasn't only electrical, it was human. She needed insulation that could hold heat without trapping moisture, fabric that wouldn't stiffen when wet. Nothing in military inventory fit the bill, so she went off base. A week later, she found herself in a tailor's shop in St. John's, Newfoundland. The old owner, Mrs. Callahan, raised an eyebrow when Eleanor laid blueprints across the counter. "You want me to sew wires into flight suits?" the woman asked. "That's not tailoring, love, that's witchcraft." Eleanor smiled. "Maybe. But if it works, it'll keep boys alive long enough to come home." Mrs. Callahan's daughter had lost her fiancé over the Atlantic the year before. She didn't ask more questions. That night, she and her apprentices worked by candlelight, cutting old wool uniforms into panels, stitching thin metallic filaments between the layers. Eleanor handled the circuitry herself, attaching each vest to a salvaged 12-volt pack and a crude waterproof switch. When they finished, 5 prototypes lay folded neatly on the table, grey, heavy, ugly. But they might have been the most beautiful things Eleanor had ever seen. She smuggled them back to base in the back of a supply truck. Officially, they were modified emergency garments for cold weather trials. Unofficially, they were contraband. Only Larkin and 2 medics knew the truth. The first test took place inside the hangar's cold chamber, a converted storage room used for preserving rations. The air inside bit like a blade. Eleanor put on the prototype herself. She refused to risk anyone else's life on an unproven design. Larkin connected the battery. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he asked. She nodded. "Turn it on." At first, nothing. Then the vest shuddered with a faint hum. A pulse of warmth spread across her chest. It worked. She smiled just before the smell of burning wool hit her nose. A wisp of smoke rose from the left shoulder. Larkin yanked the power cord free. The lights flickered as the fuse blew. Eleanor coughed, half-choked, half-laughing. "Progress," she whispered, patting the scorched fabric. Over the next month, she refined the design relentlessly. She learned that cotton backing reduced ignition risk, that spacing the wires in diamond patterns distributed heat evenly, that waterproof lacquer sealed the filaments against corrosion. Each improvement was written in sweat and singed fingertips. She tested at night when no one was watching, often falling asleep at her workbench as the storm wind howled outside. Word spread slowly through the base. Some called her the electric angel, others that lunatic with the wires. The commander summoned her once more after rumors reached headquarters. "Lieutenant," he said, "your unauthorized experiments are bordering on insubordination. You are not an engineer. You are a statistician." She stood straighter. "Then consider this a statistical experiment, sir. One that measures how many men have to freeze before common sense warms up." He dismissed her with a warning that the next incident would end her commission. She walked out, shaking but not broken. Because the truth was simple, she was already too far in to stop. By February, she'd produced a second generation of vests using insulated copper thread sourced from a civilian radio factory. Larkin built a waterproof casing for the battery, using old oxygen mask housings. They tested it again in the cold chamber. This time, Eleanor stood still as the power switched on. 10 seconds. 20. 1 minute. The heat bloomed evenly across her torso, steady and controlled. No smoke, no fire, only warmth. She lifted her hands to her face and felt tears freezing on her lashes. Larkin whistled softly. "Well, I'll be damned. You did it." But Eleanor wasn't celebrating yet. "It works in here," she said, "but the Atlantic isn't a laboratory. They needed a real test." 2 days later, under a pretext of equipment calibration, she and Larkin drove to the edge of the harbour. The snow was falling sideways. Eleanor slipped into a rubberized flight suit with the heated vest underneath secured the battery pack to her chest and walked toward the freezing water. Larkin grabbed her arm. "Ma'am, this is suicide." "Not if it works," she replied and stepped in. The shock of the cold hit like a hammer. Her breath seized, her pulse spiked. For 5 eternal seconds she thought she'd made a fatal mistake. Then the heat came slowly at first, then blooming through her core like a second heartbeat. The water was death cold, but inside the vest her body held steady. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Her teeth stopped chattering. Her fingers moved. Her mind stayed clear. When Larkin finally pulled her out, she collapsed on the dock, gasping. "Temperature?" she asked between breaths. He checked the thermometer under her arm. 98.4. She laughed, raw and disbelieving. "Then it's possible." That night she recorded her findings in a notebook she hid beneath the floorboards: voltage, duration, heat retention, survival time. She titled the page simply, "Thermal MK." It wasn't perfect, it was heavy, unstable, and nearly impossible to mass-produce. But it proved a point that could no longer be ignored: the cold could be beaten. As she stared at the faint glow of the test lamp across the room, Eleanor realized the war had just shifted. It was no longer between nations or even between life and death, it was between those who accepted loss and those who refused to. She smiled faintly, her skin still tingling from the heat. The Atlantic might take her next, but not without a fight. The morning of the 3rd of March 1944 came with a kind of silence that only precedes something irreversible. The sea lay steel grey beneath a sky full of warning, the kind that made every man on base breathe slower. In the hangar, Eleanor Vance stood beside a long wooden table, lined with 6 folded garments, the latest versions of her heated vests, newly wired, newly tested, and about to face their judgment. Around her were officers who had once mocked her. None of them were laughing now. The order had come from Command Official Field Trials, Operation Frostlight. The Navy needed proof before authorization, and the only proof that mattered was survival. Each vest was connected to a small voltage regulator attached to the aircraft's power system. The test crew consisted of 4 volunteers from the patrol squadron men who had lost friends to the cold and didn't believe in luck anymore. Eleanor looked at them before takeoff. Their faces were calm, but the calm that came from exhaustion, not peace. She fastened one of the vests herself, her hands trembling as she adjusted the battery cord under Sergeant Harris's flight jacket. "It'll feel strange at first," she told him. "Then it'll feel like being alive again." He smiled faintly. "Ma'am, that's good enough for me." The aircraft lifted into the storm, its engines fading into a dull roar swallowed by the sky. Eleanor stayed behind with Larkin in the operations room, eyes fixed on the clock. Each minute felt like glass grinding underfoot. The plan was simple. The bomber would simulate an emergency ditching, dropping a life raft into the water at coordinates 20 miles offshore. 2 men would jump, stay afloat, and activate the heating units. A rescue launch would recover them within 20 minutes. That was the theory. 10 minutes after takeoff, the radio crackled. "This is Eagle 1, commencing drop." A pause, then static. The room went still. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles whitened. The next voice came through faintly, almost lost to wind, vest engaged, temperature rising, holding steady. Then came the longest silence of her life. When the rescue boat returned 40 minutes later, both men were conscious. Their faces were flushed, not frozen. Their core temperatures had held at 98 degrees. The medics checked, rechecked, and stared in disbelief. "No hypothermia," one whispered. "None." The impossible had happened. The ocean had met its match, but Eleanor wasn't ready to celebrate. She needed more than one miracle, she needed numbers. For the next 6 weeks, she coordinated every cold weather patrol she could, distributing modified vests in secret to test groups, while other crews flew without them. Each mission was another roll of dice against the sea. By late April, the results began to form a pattern, one that no statistician could ignore. Of 30 ditching incidents across the North Atlantic, crews equipped with the heated vests showed a survival rate of 72%, those without less than 18%. The difference was no longer theoretical. It was the difference between life and obituary. She presented the findings to the medical board in London that May. The room was filled with men in crisp uniforms and colder expressions. Charts and graphs lined the wall, each bar a tombstone turned into data. Eleanor stood at the podium, her voice steady but fierce. "Gentlemen, these are not experiments. These are names." She pointed to a chart comparing body temperatures. "This line here, 98.6, is what a living man looks like. This line, 72, is a corpse. The vest made the difference every single time." One of the senior officers leaned back. "Lieutenant, are you suggesting that electrical clothing should replace standard survival gear?" She met his gaze. "I'm not suggesting it. I'm telling you it already has." A murmur rippled across the room. They wanted more evidence. She handed them the British rescue reports, the medical readings, the autopsy comparisons. Every document bore the same story, written in different ink. The cold had finally lost its monopoly on death. Then came the real test combat deployment. The vests were authorized for limited issue to Coastal Command's B-24 squadrons under the quiet label Thermal Protective Apparatus Type 5. No one wanted to make headlines over an invention that had been ridiculed months earlier. But for the men wearing them, it wasn't about politics. It was survival stitched into cloth. The first combat proof came faster than anyone expected. On May 17, a Liberator patrolling near Greenland was hit by flak from a U-boat's deck gun. The pilot ditched in sub-freezing waters. 3 crewmen wore Eleanor's vests, 2 didn't. When the rescue plane arrived 40 minutes later, the 3 wearing her invention were conscious and coherent. The others were gone. The flight surgeon's report landed on Eleanor's desk 2 days later, still damp from the sea. All 3 subjects wearing Type 5 apparatus survived beyond hypothermic threshold. Core temp stable. Device functional. She read it once, twice, and then set it down, her eyes burning. The math had shifted. For the first time, the rescue crews began to believe they might actually be rescuing the living. Word spread quietly through the ranks, ask for the warm vest. Mechanics began building crude replicas using leftover wiring. Airmen wrote letters home describing a strange hum under their uniforms, a pulse of heat that felt like faith itself. Eleanor visited the survivors a week later. They sat in the infirmary, pale but smiling, sipping coffee like it was the first good thing they'd tasted in years. Sergeant Harris looked up as she entered. "We heard you built these things," he said, tapping the vest folded beside him. "Saved my damn life." She tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. He grinned anyway. You should have seen the look on the medic's face when he realized I wasn't frozen. She stayed long after lights out talking with them, listening to how the water had felt different, less cruel, less final. For the first time in months, she slept that night without hearing waves in her dreams. But success came with scrutiny. Headquarters demanded replication under standardized production. Civilian factories were contacted, electrical engineers were consulted. Suddenly everyone wanted to claim credit for thermal innovation. Reports labeled it a collective achievement. Her name was buried under layers of bureaucracy. She didn't care. What mattered was that fewer bodies were coming back blue. By July, over 2,000 vests had been issued across the Atlantic Fleet. Statistical analysis from the Navy's Medical Research Division confirmed a 68% reduction in hypothermia-related fatalities. The report concluded dryly, thermal-assisted garments provide measurable increase in crew survivability. But between the lines, it meant something far greater. It meant Eleanor's impossible idea had become policy. Still, the war didn't slow for gratitude. That August, a supply convoy to Iceland hit a blizzard head-on. 4 aircraft went down. Only one carried her vests. All 6 crewmen lived. When the rescue team brought them in, one pilot joked through chattering teeth. "I guess the crazy lieutenant was right." The medic who recorded the case underlined a single phrase in his log: "No fatalities." Eleanor received a telegram weeks later. It bore no signature, only 2 words: "It worked." She stared at it for a long time, then folded it into her journal. Around her, the base buzzed with activity engines, starting for new missions, the endless machinery of war grinding forward. But for once, she felt that somewhere inside that machine a heartbeat was still human. The official commendation never came. No medals, no parades, just the quiet understanding that hundreds of men would wake up tomorrow because she refused to accept their deaths as statistics. In her final field report she wrote, "When warmth becomes weaponized, hope returns to the battlefield. Survival is no longer luck, it's design." Months later, the Navy published a confidential circular confirming the success of the thermal project. It included one final data table: mean body temperature retention over time. The figures told a story more eloquent than any speech. 98, 97, 96. Lives held steady against the freezing dark. Eleanor stood at the edge of the runway one evening, watching a flight depart into the setting Sunday. The air was sharp, the cold biting, but beneath her coat she wore the prototype that had started it all, the one with burn marks on the shoulder and hand-stitched copper lines still intact. She touched the scarred fabric and smiled faintly. The world would forget the names, the tests, the long nights of failure. But every plane that flew now carried a small defiance stitched into its seams, a quiet flame that refused to die. For the first time, the math of survival had started to change. By the fall of 1944, the war machine had finally caught up with her vision. What had begun as a forbidden experiment in a freezing hangar was now a classified production order stamped with the seal of the United States Navy. Eleanor's thermal MKI vest had evolved into the Type 7 survival garment approved for all Atlantic patrol and transport squadrons. The order came quietly buried under logistics reports, but for those who understood the numbers, it was revolutionary. Factories that once built cockpit heaters and radio coils now turned their assembly lines toward something far more human: warmth. In Cleveland, Detroit, and Boston, machinists and seamstresses stood shoulder to shoulder under the clang of presses and the hum of conveyor belts. Rolls of wool and canvas fed through cutters while women in blue overalls sewed copper filaments into diamond-shaped grids. Engineers calibrated voltage regulators on benches that smelled of oil and ozone. In one corner, a sign hung over a workstation. "This thread saves lives." It wasn't propaganda, it was truth. Every worker there had read the reports. Every one of them knew that somewhere over the Atlantic a man might live because of the wire they touched. Production surged at an impossible pace. Within 6 weeks, 20,000 units rolled out. Within 3 months, the number tripled. Allied commands exchanged specifications. British factories in Liverpool and Sheffield adapted the design for RAF Coastal Command, calling it the Warm Flight Suit. Canadian air bases followed suit. The Atlantic, once an open grave, was being rewired from the inside out. For Eleanor, the transformation was surreal. She toured one of the factories that winter and stopped at a workstation where a young woman was testing vest circuits under a row of glowing lamps. "My brother flies convoy escorts," the girl said without looking up. "He says they don't call it a heater anymore, they call it hope." Eleanor smiled faintly. She wanted to tell her how many nights that word had kept her alive, but she couldn't speak. The clatter of machines around them was louder than words. The first large-scale deployment came during Operation Deadlight, the final offensive against remaining U-boats off Norway. Hundreds of patrol bombers flew through brutal sub-zero winds and polar squalls. When one B-24 was hit by anti-aircraft fire and ditched near Trondheim, the rescue logs told a story no one would forget. All 8 crewmen were recovered alive after 45 minutes in the North Sea. The report read simply, all wearing Type 7 apparatus, core temperature sustained. For the first time, the North Atlantic hadn't taken anyone. The impact rippled beyond statistics. Morale shifted in ways that no speech could replicate. Air crews began volunteering for longer missions. Flight surgeons noted a decline in anxiety-related breakdowns. Men who once whispered prayers over the ocean now hummed under their breath, the faint electrical vibration of the vests warming them like a heartbeat. It wasn't invincibility, they felt it was the return of faith in human ingenuity. Commanders noticed it too. Survival training manuals were rewritten to include thermal systems. Rescue operations expanded farther north, confident they'd reach men still breathing. Even strategic planning changed. Missions, once deemed too dangerous in winter months, were now scheduled with renewed aggression. The line between life and death had moved, and with it the edge of the war. But behind every victory stood the weight of memory. Eleanor watched from the edge of the runway one freezing dawn as a squadron of liberators taxied out their crews, laughing, tapping the small control switches on their chests. She thought of the first prototype, the one that had nearly set her on fire, and the long nights of smoke and failure. Now those sparks had become lifelines, stretched across the ocean. Months later, a formal commendation came through the chain of command signed by the Surgeon General himself. The thermal protective program has significantly reduced mortality in air-sea operations and contributed materially to Allied effectiveness in the Atlantic theatre. There was no mention of her name. She didn't expect one. Recognition wasn't the point. Lives were. The program expanded to other fronts. Arctic convoys, bomber escorts over the North Sea, even medevac crews in Italy began wearing variants of the design. Allied engineers adapted it into electrically heated gloves and boots. By winter 1945, total cold-related fatalities among airmen had dropped by over 70%. The numbers spoke with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel slicing through disbelief. In February 1945, when a storm crippled a convoy off Iceland, 23 men were pulled from the sea alive, each wearing a heated suit. The commander of the rescue ship wrote in his log, "They should have been dead." Instead, they were shivering, swearing, and demanding hot coffee. "I've never been so glad to be wrong." Eleanor read that line in the dim light of her office and felt the full weight of what had happened. Her invention hadn't changed the nature of war, it had changed the value of a single life within it. It had turned statistics into survivors, probabilities into promises. For the first time, victory wasn't measured in enemies destroyed, but in lives reclaimed from oblivion. By the end of the war, the Type 7 vest was standard issue for every Allied air-sea crew. Over 80,000 units had been produced. The military would later claim it as a natural evolution of existing technology, a product of collective effort. But among the pilots and medics who saw what it could do, there was no confusion. They called it Vance's warmth. In April 1945, as Germany collapsed and the world staggered toward peace, Eleanor stood on a factory floor in Boston, watching the final batch roll off the line. The workers paused as she passed, not saluting, but nodding quietly. The air smelled of oil, copper, and something almost sacred purpose. The last vest in the shipment bore a small engraving inside the collar. To those who refused to freeze, that night she wrote a single sentence in her logbook before closing it for good. Sometimes the smallest spark can thaw an empire of indifference. And as the ships carried her invention across the Atlantic, the currents that once claimed thousands of men now carried something else, a quiet defiance stitched in steel and thread, a reminder that even in the coldest war, humanity could still burn bright enough to change its own fate. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. The ocean that had swallowed so many now shimmered under the pale light of peace, calm but not innocent. The North Atlantic had kept its ghosts, and among the names lost to time, a few were saved by something born from one woman's refusal to accept death as inevitable. Eleanor Vance returned to the mainland that summer, a captain but without ceremony. No parade waited, no speech, no medal pinned to her chest. The war's spotlight turned toward generals and victors, not the quiet figures who had built lifelines out of wire and stubbornness. But that didn't matter. Her work had already outlived the headlines. In the months that followed, the government declassified portions of the thermal protection program for civilian adaptation. Factories that had once built flight suits began producing heated jackets for Arctic researchers and maritime rescue teams. The concept spread like warmth itself. Railway workers in Alaska, doctors in mobile hospitals, and even mountain climbers on Everest used variations of her design. The same principles that saved men from the Atlantic would later heat the suits of test pilots and decades later astronauts orbiting a silent, frozen sky. The line between survival and discovery blurred. Eleanor turned down every offer to patent the technology. "It was never mine," she told a reporter who tracked her down in 1946. "It belonged to the men who froze before I could save them." She returned to her small hometown in Vermont, teaching at a local college, writing papers under her students' names, and vanishing into anonymity as the world rebuilt itself. But the invention refused to vanish with her. In 1950, a display opened quietly at the Smithsonian, a glass case containing a weathered vest with burn marks on the shoulder and a label that read, "Prototype Thermal Protective Apparatus, Merc I, donated anonymously." Next to it was a photograph of smiling airmen in soaked uniforms, their faces alive with disbelief. Visitors rarely lingered long, but those who did often left silent, as if standing before something more sacred than metal and fabric. Her story might have ended there, buried beneath the progress of a new age, if not for a journalist who stumbled upon her wartime reports while researching early aviation medicine. The article he published in the Atlantic Review called her invention one of the quiet revolutions of survival. Letters poured in from veterans who owed their lives to the warm vests. One wrote, "I never knew who made it, but whoever she was, she kept the ocean from taking me." Another simply said, "I felt her courage in the heat that saved me." When word reached Eleanor, she didn't respond publicly. But in her journal, she wrote a single line, "Recognition is the afterglow of purpose." By the 1960 seconds, her principles had been woven into modern safety engineering, firefighter suits, medical blankets for newborns, even the emergency gear used by polar explorers. Her invention became so ubiquitous that it no longer carried a name. It became an assumption, a quiet part of how humanity prepared for the cold. In 1971, long after she had retired the U.S., Air Force contacted her to attend the dedication of a new memorial at Andrews Field. She almost declined, thinking it was another ceremonial nod to something she had already buried. But when she arrived, she found a bronze statue, small and unassuming, depicting a pilot kneeling on a frozen shore, clutching a glowing vest to his chest. The plaque beneath read, "To those who turned warmth into a weapon." Her name wasn't there. She smiled anyway. An officer approached her quietly. "Ma'am, most people here don't know who you are," he said. "But I do. My father was one of the men pulled from the sea near Iceland in '44. He used to say the heat in that vest felt like a heartbeat that wasn't his own." Eleanor looked out at the monument, her breath misting in the cold air. "It never was," she said softly. "It belonged to everyone who refused to give up." Years passed and wars came again, each with new inventions, new saviors, new tragedies. But her legacy endured in ways few recognized. The heated lining in a paramedic's coat, the warmth beneath a diver's suit, the electric gloves worn by linemen repairing power lines in blizzards, all traced their origin to a winter night when one woman dared to believe that warmth could be engineered out of empathy. Historians would later write about radar codebreakers, jet engines, the visible triumphs of science in wartime. But buried between the footnotes was her story, a quiet rebellion against indifference. Because while war had created machines of destruction, it had also, through her, created an instrument of mercy. Standing before her classroom, one snowy evening in 1975, she ended her lecture with a phrase that students would quote for decades. "War creates monsters," she said, her eyes distant, but sometimes it forges miracles. The room fell silent. For a moment they could almost hear the ocean beyond the walls, the one that had once devoured men whole and now carried the memory of those it failed to take. Eleanor Vance died in 1,983 inches, her sleep surrounded by the gentle hum of the electric blanket she'd refused to unplug even in spring. At her funeral, a handful of former pilots sent folded letters to her family, each signed only with a date and a latitude. Her niece opened one and found a note inside that read, "I was pulled from the Atlantic 40 years ago. I'm alive because she believed we could be." Today, in a corner of the Smithsonian's aviation wing, her vest still hangs under soft light. The copper wiring has dulled the fabric, frayed with age, but the label remains clear. Recovered from a B-24 rescue 1944. Visitors walk past unaware that they're standing before the birth of every modern survival suit. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the hum of current running through it, the sound of defiance against the cold. In the end, Eleanor's story reminds us that the greatest victories aren't always measured by flags raised or enemies defeated, but by the warmth we leave behind. Because history remembers those who win wars, but the world endures because of those who save lives. And somewhere between frost and fire, one woman proved that compassion armed with science could rewrite the meaning of survival. The war had ended decades ago, but its echoes still lived in the hum of machines, the pulse of electricity that kept humanity alive in the coldest corners of the earth. What began in the chaos of 1943, a handful of copper wires, a defiant dream, and a woman who refused to accept statistics as fate, had become a legacy woven into the fabric of modern life. From the thermal suits of polar explorers to the flight uniforms of astronauts orbiting the silence of space, the warmth Eleanor Vance created had outlasted every gun, every empire, every war. Standing before her display at the Smithsonian today, you can almost feel that warmth radiating through time, a quiet defiance against indifference. It reminds us that history isn't only built by those who commanded armies or captured flags, but by those who fought smaller, harder battles against disbelief, against bureaucracy, against the idea that some lives are expendable. Eleanor's story isn't one of glory, it's one of persistence. She didn't change the war, but she changed what war could no longer destroy: the will to protect, to preserve, to humanize survival. Her invention taught the world that courage wasn't just the act of facing death, but the decision to make life worth saving. And perhaps that is her true victory. In a century that learned to conquer with fire, she taught us to fight with warmth. Her legacy burns not in monuments or medals, but in every life spared from the cold. Because in the end, history's greatest revolutions are not explosions, they are the quiet sparks that refuse to die. And somewhere in the endless hum of a world still learning how to care, Eleanor's fire is still burning.